Fantasy armies are one of the most overlooked and simplified parts of world building. It's hard to count how many times I saw a generic fantasy army where aesthetics and flavor always took priority over in-universe reasoning and sensical structure. Sure, those things are also important, and just like in real life, looks and aesthetics are what attracts people. But what's the point of attracting if you cannot hold anyone with your deep character and interesting personality? And it's the same with fiction. Any part of world building that might look cool will attract people, sure, but no one will care if upon closer inspection they'll discover that there's nothing of value aside of the rule of cool. Setting is the most fundamental thing when it comes to creating fantasy armies. And fantasy by itself is divided into many different subcategories. However, there are two major ones that influence it the most: low fantasy and high fantasy. Low fantasy is much friendlier to beginners in writing, as it is much closer to our own reality, with only bits and pieces of magic and fantastical elements here and there. Designing armies in a low fantasy universe is actually pretty easy because we have a giant helpful resource which is called human history. Low fantasy is usually very similar to our own universe, and with few fantastical elements, you can take a lot of ideas and helpful guides on military structures from historical sources, because there are not that many strange and alien things like magic, different races, or fantastical beasts that would normally heavily influence how an army is structured. Just do some basic research on, Egyptian and Persian armies, for example, mix some things together, and you already have a very solid fundament to write on and expand to fit what you want to do. High fantasy, on the other hand, is much more complicated, because now you introduce a heavy dose of magic and paranormal things that do not exist in our world, so you can't really take that much example from our own military history. Whenever you introduce a fantastical race with a different biology than humans, or some fantastical beasts that can be tamed and used effectively on the battlefield, you need to now take all of those things into account. What tactics would emerge if I create and introduce those giant hulking beasts? Will people still use plate armor if I introduce magic? Oh, yeah, magic. This alone can be a huge factor that contributes to the structure of your armies. Because sure, you can make your magic users into artillery by making them throw fireballs at long distances. But what about geomancers, for example? The ability to manipulate earth is much more destructive and useful in the battlefield than throwing some fireballs. You can make a rock slide fall on the enemy, make a giant hole in the ground so the enemy will not even be able to pass. And I'm just casually talking about one form of magic. Remember that magic will heavily influence the structure of armies. Formation fighting will most probably be completely gone, as that would attract the attention of giant area of effect spells. As I said, high fantasy with a lot of magical and out of ordinary elements is much more complex, so if you are just beginning to write, maybe stick to a low fantasy setting for now, or just avoid warfare if you really want to do high fantasy. Now when you know what possibilities you have and what potential your setting is giving you need to first organize your army. Yes, no matter what you create, even if it's a mindless horde of bugs, if you want to call it an army, it needs to be organized in any way. And normally armies are organized from top to bottom, but this time you are creating your army in your world, in your fantasy universe, so we will start from the bottom to the top, from the normal, casual, everyday soldier. So, who is the common soldier? How is he equipped? What is the overall martial culture of the country? You need to remember that not all armies are structured in a 100% pragmatic way, especially in a fantasy setting with low technology. Based on what country this army represents, you need to always mind the overall culture of the people. What do they value? What is their belief system? Do they have a hierarchy in their country? Is the country that this army represents a multi-ethnic or multiracial one? Is there a dominant fantasy race or a ethnicity that is central to the culture? If yes, then the other minorities might form auxiliary forces, as it was done, for example, in Carthage, where different groups of people from different parts of Carthage were fighting as their own separate force of minorities. This has, of course, pros and cons. People who come from the same place and share the same value and culture are much more likely to bond together and be loyal to themselves. It's less likely that the entire platoon or legion of this force will just run away, as they will not abandon their own during battle. However, that might form a disconnect from the main core of your force. They might be strongly bonded and form loyalties between themselves, but might not agree with the broader empire that they are a part of. This can either lead to desertion of entire groups if situation will be bad enough, or if the war is over, now a big group of armed, experienced and organized soldiers go back to their province and can be a potential force of insurrectionists. But if you integrate these minorities within the structure of the core of your army, that will make them feel separated from their own, and they will not have such great bonds with others, but at least they will feel more integrated into the dominant culture and might reduce the chance of future rebellions if they go back home. Of course, this is just the bottom everyday person who serves, but we need to start to go up the command chain. For an army to be organized, it needs a command structure, any command structure. It needs officers, seniors who are more experienced and are more charismatic and have a sense of authority. Depending on the culture, those might be promoted from lower ranks or might be taken from nobility or by any other means that this specific country value its martial culture. Maybe there are certain higher up ranks that are gate-kept by law or by a hierarchy and are served to only a caste of people, maybe a specific race or a magically inclined individuals, like the chief marshal being only available for the royal family, the master of logistics only to higher ranks of the merchant guild because they have some kind of deal with the state. In terms of the entire army, you need to think about the size of certain units. For example, is there a limit of people in one unit? How are big units divided into smaller ones? Or are they even divided at all? Maybe there is a big divide between levied troops and professional ones in terms of organization, where levies don't really have any unit sizes, but the professional core of your army is very strictly structured around the unit sizes and command structure within them. Of course, this has so many variables that we could go on and on for hours, but I wanted to present the most important factors for you to remember. Before going to war, you need to raise your army first, but this, next to logistics, is one of the most overlooked thing in fantasy and basically any fiction world building. You might think this is not important because you write your story just to have a big epic battle with fantasy magical explosion in the background. However, this is much more important than you might think, because how your army is structured and how it is drafted, how it is raised, how it comes to be one single force, it will highly determine how the war will go on, how it will end, and what will be the consequences after the war has ended. Will those people who came back home work on your economy now? Or maybe they never came back home. Maybe they came back home, but soldiering gave them some ideas and now they will be a nuisance in your world. This thing is extremely important for later consequences in your world building. If soldiers are drafted by force, that on the other hand might cause some issues. Or it might not. You need to always remember about the culture of the country that your army is a part of. If this kingdom, for example, have a high martial culture engraved into its own identity, a draft might be even seen as an honor. Although a draft has the issue of getting people into your army that might not want to fight. Those people will usually have lower morale and lower incentive to fight. A voluntary army, on the other hand, guarantee that if someone joins, they do it because they want to do it. Of course, you can mix a lot of different types of recruitment methods. When gathering armies, you need to also create central points of gathering, places where you gather troops from a specific region, for example. Then this point of gathering, send those troops to one chosen place where the entire army is supposed to gather. If you really want to get into the details of such things, I will highly recommend some historical channels that cover such topics, because this subject alone is worth hours of discussion. Sound Roman History is one of those channels that I actually use, and they talk about these niche topics, and you can learn a lot of very small details from those videos. Moving large groups of people between point A to point B with all their equipment and have them ready for war require a lot of resources. They need to eat, they need to shit, they need to have some entertainment in the months of walking that they will be doing. They still need to be paid, they need cold weather or hot weather gear if moving through an extreme terrain. You need medics who will help with injuries and diseases which will inevitably happen. They need blacksmiths and people and resources to maintain equipment and carts and horses or other animals that are used to tow equipment. If that sounds overwhelming, then yes, good world building is hard. Of course, if warfare is not the main focus of your story, you can always have it in the background. Show your audience that you actually think about those things, but you don't need to go into the smallest numbers. If an army moves through a desert, make sure that this will be devastating and will result in high attrition, unless you have a fantasy race that is specifically good at operating in that area. If your army moves from an island to a different island, remember to mention where did they get their food from, and if they settled somewhere, they need to settle near a source of water. You don't need to calculate everything, but even showing a basic level of care about the subject will really help to sell your story as deeper and more fleshed out. Even in Lord of the Rings movies, they show the Rohan army gathering, showing that soldiers actually came from somewhere and are camping.
How many?
I bring 500 men from the West Fold, my lord.
We have 300 more from Denmark, Commander King.
They actually camped in a place that makes sense. There is a river, a good source of water, a forest to hunt small game if low on resources, an overlook camp in a mountain shelf showing good view of the area in the case of danger. They didn't need to do this, and yet they added those small things because it is important to show movement and organization. And of course, when the war ends, or even during a war, you need to remember about casualties. Casualties is not something that you can take lightly. Remember that a soldier is also a resource that does not appear out of nowhere. A kingdom that has a population of, for example, 5 million will struggle a lot to muster an army of 100,000 soldiers. And each soldier that dies or becomes maimed during a war is a blow to the economy, because each soldier that does not come back home is yet another person that can no longer work and contribute to the wealth of its nation. Of course, do not obsess over every single small detail, especially if your story does not focus on warfare. But if in your story an army moves from point A to point B and they need to move through a jungle, for example, you need to remember that disease is a factor, getting clean water is a factor. If an army camp, make sure that they camp in a place that makes sense for them. In addition, try to avoid the rule of cool concept, because this can really damage your storytelling and your world building. Sure, if you have like a great idea of, something cool in your army, a weapon or a unit that you really want to introduce, sure, make it, but try to think how it will fit and make sense in your universe. And if you feel overwhelmed by the scale of things, and you often procrastinate when writing, and you lack motivation, and all of those things are really make you question about if you're doing it correct, or if you should even continue doing it, I went through the exact same things. And because of that, I wrote this short ebook that you can download for free down in the description down below. And that will be all for today. I hope that you took a lot of value from that video, and there is something special coming Monday, Tuesday. You'll see. For now, have a great day. And remember that you're just one page, one chapter away from writing a great story.